Jung described the principle of eros as the great binder and as a force of coupling and the connecting principle, which brings inner and outer together in different forms of creative syntheses. And so this eros then I see as a co-evolutionary force of attraction. And I know you've written also about the law of attraction based on Paul Camera. Attraction, affinity, and love, and maybe the convergent force underlying evolution. And in my earlier writing on intuition, I described the idea of an evolutionary embrace. So this big evolutionary embracing, and I think that's part of what's happening at a microcosmic level with the cell, but I can also see is happening in our psyches as we work to with our intuition and imagination to make meaning out of our synchronicities.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernie Beitman. I'm a psychiatrist, and yes, I'm a psychiatrist. I like to study people's minds, interactions, and also reality. And meaningful coincidences give us hints about how reality works. And one of the ways to understand how reality works is to understand how synchronicities work. And a lot of people like to have just, oh, they're caused by this. The usual things being random or God or universe or something bigger. So it's statistical or it's something grander than us. It's not that way. As a lot of things on Earth, synchronicities have multiple explanations or multiple vectors coming into making them happen. And probability or statistics is only one of them. A main other one is your own intention or expectation or your own curiosity. So another one is like, how curious are you to know what's going on? Our guest today met her husband in a social dynamics way. You have to have people around. Coincidences just don't happen to two people or just by yourself. A lot of times there's other people around and they have something to do with it. So she was told to get a partner in a class she was in, and that partner has been with her for many, many years as her husband. So social dynamics make a big difference. Other variables are cultural and historic. Just what's the historic and cultural background within which coincident synchronicities take place? And a fundamental aspect of them is intuition. Does this feel like something I want to do or not want to do? There are other variables, but I want to give you the idea that there are multiple vectors that come in to making meaningful coincidences happen. And our guest today will talk about her particular way of thinking about them, and she's got a lot of ideas about how synchronicity might work and how they have happened with her. And so I will introduce you to Monica Bryant. Now, Monica Bryant is a very multi-talented person. She's an evolutionary consultant and coach who has provided archetypal perspectives to support soul evolution. And she's been doing this since 1994, I think before that even personally. She is an independent transdisciplinary researcher with an ecological and holistic worldview. Her MA was on transforming learning, synchronicity, and transpersonal research methodologies. A key idea to keep in mind with Monica, she's pioneered symbiosis. Symbiosis restoring approach for health. She's taught the new microbiology at the University of Sussex in the 1980s and has trained practitioners internationally. Symbiosis, you'll hear, is a very important part of what Monica's life has been around. The new microbiology at the University of Sussex, as I mentioned, and has trained practitioners in the symbiosis ideas and others for many years. For 30 years, she was director of her company promoting natural health, evolutionary. You can get her. You can see where you can find her link at evolutionary.co.uk. She's written an excellent chapter in The Playful Universe, a book about the many personal aspects of synchronicity. For many of the authors, I have contributed to that as well. So, Monica, welcome to Meaningful Coincidences, the Connecting with Coincidence podcast.
Thank you, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I look forward to an exchange as we have many shared interests.
And we've had many good conversations before. So let me ask you to tell us a coincidence story.
I would like to share a really big one for me, which I call California Calling. Now, this was a life-changing synchronicity that was followed by chains of multiple coincidences, which had a transformative impact and accelerated my personal evolution. So this occurred, it was back in 1982, following my university graduation. I had this inner calling to go to California. As I did not know anyone in the USA, I went to the Mind, Body, Spirit Festival office in London, hoping to gather some helpful contacts. Shortly after arriving there, I was offered a job in San Francisco. Although I was really surprised, I immediately had this inner yes and accepted. A few weeks later, I was catapulted into the hub of the human and planetary potential movements. Mill Valley in Marin County, just north of San Francisco, became my home, and I was surrounded by creative pioneers, healers, and spiritual retreats. I discovered a wide range of psychospiritual therapies, approaches to holistic health, and the very exciting at that time, the emergence of leading edge new paradigm thinkers. I met inspirational authors, including Willis Harman, Dane Rudyard, and Buckminster Fuller. And as a guest, I was invited to the Dynamic Esalen Institute and connected with transpersonal psychology pioneers. Social symbiotic alliances were formed to serve the higher purpose of saving the world. Working within this holistic community that encouraged networking, frequent synchronicities occurred with interconnections touching just every aspect of life. Now, there are many, many meanings that have emerged out of this California's synchronicity, but it's been personally meaningful because I dared to and trusted my intuition. So I followed my intuition, had an intention to find some Californian contacts, and suddenly I found myself employed to make connections with hundreds of extraordinary people. Out of the blue, like a cosmic seed moment, a portal opened to a new, expanded, and multi-dimensional life. I was immersed in the field of consciousness research, involving a multitude of expressions for mind, body, and soul. It was a time filled with peak experiences which transformed my consciousness and continues to inform my awareness today. There could be more to be said there, but it was really amazing to suddenly join into a far greater whole, like a spiritual family of like-minded individuals and groups committed to healing themselves and others. And in many respects, I left my heart in San Francisco and have kept my connection with the transpersonal work in particular emerging out of the Bay Area and the USA.
Well, that's a story that I want to emphasize some highlights that you kind of had an idea of going to California, and so you wander into a place and talk to some people, and it becomes a portal. And we think of these things as like portals to different planets. Uh, and certainly California, when you went there, was a different planet than London was. And you were rocket shipped. You had, yeah, to take a plane, but your mind was shipped over into this fantastic wonderland that's of very forward-thinking people, and there you were finding what I'd say your soul was searching for, the kinds of environment and people and context that would help you flourish. It's funny for me because something like that happened to me when I was going to Los Angeles. I made a phone call and I ended up in what became the beginning of the hippie culture in the late 60s. So there are times when we can open doors if we have an intuition and are open to possibilities because you didn't know what was going to happen. And there you were seeing the future right now in California, and your heart's still in San Francisco. But as you talk about this, I think it's worthwhile uh, for us to hear what you mean by symbiosis and how symbiosis relates to synchronicity and may be part of what you just described.
Um, okay. There's much that could be said, so I'll just say a few key points here. Um, uh, Basically, I started in the Scandinavian naturopathic tradition. Um, I learned a lot there that inspired me and has been a life thread of research and professional experience. And so most of you know that the field of probiotics, which I pioneered for human health back in the early 80s, microbiota and the microbiome research now is part of the collective psyche and has expanded from the earlier days of nutritional therapies to mainstream allopathic medicine. And
Would you repeat that? Because I think it's worth emphasizing what you just said, that you were at the beginning of something very much part of this reality now.
well, because I was brought up in the tradition of naturopathy, health food stores would have yogurt, and lactic acid bacteria were appreciated as being good and beneficial. So when I introduced the concept of probiotics, meaning pro-life, and promoting the positive aspect of bacteria back in the 80s when I lectured internationally to practitioners and natural health practitioners, to doctors, but also, interestingly, probiotics attracted a lot of attention from spiritual audiences. And I could see that probiotics and learning about the microflora of the body was an earlier iteration of what Synchronicity is doing now, which is quite simply saying we're all interconnected, that we're in a dynamic interaction between what we perceive as ourselves and our environment. And so it caught on like fire, but it also met with resistance. The programming of fear around microbes and bacteria was so strong and still is in the psyche, but more and more people are coming to appreciate we need to have more contact and embrace the microbial world for our health and to increase the biodiversity in our gut flora.
Yeah. And how does that relate to synchronicity now, do you think?
Well, If you think about it, it's basically saying all is connected. When you go into realizing the number of trillions of bacteria that make us up and the soil and the environment, and there's a constant exchange every day through what we eat and what we touch and how we interact with others, it just fuzzes the self and other, inner and outer. The inner and outer boundary dissolves.
Isn't there something about the soil and around us has a microbes very much like those in our intestines?
Absolutely, it's all connected. So the quality of the soil, quality of the life of plants, the quality of animals, and the quality of us as human beings, there's a direct connection there. So for me, organic and biodynamic foods are a central priority in my life.
Well, one of the fundamental lessons of synchronicity is that uh, inner and outer are not as separate as what we are taught it is. That we are not that separate from our environment. In fact, we're part of our environment. Environment is part of us. And
Exactly.
what you're saying now, and it's worth emphasizing, that this theme is also true with the microbes in our intestines and the microbes in our soil, in good soil. And if you're around not such good soil, that's going to be reflected somewhat in what your microbiome has.
Absolutely. So, in terms of an aspect of personal meaning making, um, bringing my earlier life together with symbiosis and restoring symbiosis for health, and now synchronicity, they both have the same etymology, meaning with or together is the sim or sin. And so for symbiosis, it's life, um, life together, and with synchronicity, it's time together. So there's a parallel process there, one in the material, physical, biological realm, and one in the psychospiritual realm with the synchronicity.
And how does symbiosis also relate more directly to synchronicity? That's something that you have also been uh, playing around with, thinking deeply about. So please,
Yeah.
what does symbiosis mean? Would you give us a bigger definition and then go to what synchronicity and symbiosis have together?
Well, there's many ways to express symbiosis, but basically it's a ecological concept, it's relational, it's a participatory concept, and and it's working in mutual benefit. So so basically our deep interconnectedness with the microbial world is integral to our evolution through endosymbiosis, which is the symbiotic relationship where one organism lives inside another. This involves the incorporation of unicellular organisms to form inner organelles within cells, such as mitochondria, and are part then of forming multicellular host cells. So that there's a mutually beneficial relationship of an endosymbiosis, which enables greater complexity and evolutionary creativity.
And
Now
that's
that's
the,
an
go ahead.
endosymbiosis, yeah. So
That's
quite simply, you have a prokaryote or a unicellular organism that then becomes engulfed and incorporated into multicellular form, but it carries on its function then within a bigger community, if you like, within the functioning of a cell. I use mitochondria as a metaphor and have been just then taking that idea into the imaginal realm and envisaging an analogous process of an endosymbiosis, the same evolutionary dynamic, but forming an intrapsychic Symbiosis. So, so in other words, a synchronicity happens, and then if we work to really incorporate it and include it and bring it into our consciousness, it can be a real powerhouse for new insights, meanings, like metaphorical mitochondria integrated in the psyche. And I felt that very strongly when I revisited this California calling synchronicity to write the chapter. I've had so many more insights. It's just been a rich, continued meaning making process. So it makes me feel that if we tend or really incorporate our synchronicities, they can carry on for life, being a source of insights.
And the way you think about the parallel is, let's say one cell incorporates another cell,
Mm-hmm.
and then that becomes something, a dual cell, and then another cell comes along and joins them. And after they keep doing that for a while, you might get something like mitochondria, which are the energy pumps in each of our cells, convert what we eat into making the cell move is a simple way of thinking about it. But one of the things that you said that strikes me is that as each of these cells get incorporated with each other, each cell also maintains its own function.
Exactly. The other becomes part of the whole. It forms part of the community. And like you said, this happens in the evolutionary biology, which is it's now well accepted, the theory of endosymbiosis, um, uh, because there's serial endosymbioses.
Serial endosome, yeah.
Science Symbi, which is a theory which Lynn Margulis gets credit for promoting and making people aware of that. And that's also called symbiogenesis, which quite literally means to create life together. So my work has been well prior to the work of Lynn Margulis. My research has been based in the 1800s, primarily in Germany, looking at the principle of symbiosis and obviously now 100 years on it's in the mainstream psyche. But well before Lynn Margulis, there was tremendous work happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that's the work that my book will primarily be writing about.
So I can mention Paul Kammerer in this discussion, um, who was a Viennese biologist who wrote The Law of Seriality in German, which now has been translated into English by someone who I interviewed earlier on this podcast series. And you're gonna look at the English book, but you like reading it in German, which now I understand a little bit about why you can do that, read it in German. But Paul Kammerer did The Law of Seriality, which was a lead-in to synchronicity. And Jung mentioned Kammerer some, and they both had some idea that uh, these coincidences were created by something other than what we think of as usual causality, which is another subject for another time. But I'm still, from my perspective, Monica, I'm really want to focus, if we can, on how the endosymbiosis creates a new organism or new something that's functional, but each cell maintains some of its own individuality as part of the bigger thing. And I am thinking of human beings as being cells in the collective human organism in much the same way you just described the symbiosis with they're part of the whole collective human organism, but continue to function in their own individuality.
I think this is a really fundamental polarity that we all have to live with, which is self and other, or sometimes I describe it as from me to we, and that's it's really a life work. I think this balancing between our own needs or and the needs of the group or the greater whole of which we're a part. So that's an ongoing process, and it is a dance of times that where we're more self-centered and other times when we're more other-centered. And I don't know if that's what you're speaking to
It
there, but
is. It's what I'm talking about, exactly what I'm talking about. The integrative tendency versus the self-assertive tendency is one way of using phrases. There are other ones we could use, but that's just what I'm talking about. And I think synchronicity plays a key role in helping us modulate that dance between individuality and being part of the whole. Do you?
absolutely. I mean, I do fundamentally see synchronicity as an evolutionary force or part of our individuation journey. There's many languages for it, but I think synchronicity is really key, especially for the big ones, the quantum leap synchronicities, where there's a major impact. But what I've been looking to is to really think more deeply about if there's this connection between symbiosis in space or in biology and synchronicity in time, that underlying that, Jung described the principle of eros as the great binder and as a force of coupling and the connecting principle, which brings inner and outer together in different forms of creative syntheses. And so this eros then I see as a co-evolutionary force of attraction. And I know you've written also about the law of attraction based on Paul Camera. Attraction, affinity, and love, and maybe the convergent force underlying evolution. And in my earlier writing on intuition, I described the idea of an evolutionary embrace. So this big evolutionary embracing, and I think that's part of what's happening at a microcosmic level with the cell, but I can also see is happening in our psyches as we work to with our intuition and imagination to make meaning out of our synchronicities. But I just want to come back to camera very briefly and just say, when I was working on this chapter, there was a real eureka moment for me when I saw that Paul Camera had defined the term pan-symbiosis, and that Jung viewed pan-eros to permeate all nature and as a creative and procreative force. And it's interesting that the etymology of pan means all, and that's when I proposed this new term of pansynchronicity, which expresses all together now, which for me was referring really to the ubiquitous nature of synchronicity, its evolutionary and its archetypal connections in nature, psyche, and the cosmos. It's and Jung said it's there for those who have eyes to see. I said
Well,
no.
another fun way to think about it. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's like that's that was a riff that was, I don't remember where, but it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It is everywhere if you look, and that's what you're saying. You got to pay attention to it. The the California the California Dreaming one, California Calling, but there's a song by the Mamas and the Papas, South California Dreaming, which has got me to California, but it's like you were you were talking about how inner and outer come together in a meaningful way, which is like the endosymbiosis that you're talking about, where two cells come together and say, "Hey, let's dance. You be you, I'll be me, but we'll be us together," uh, is another kind of phrase that's been out there. But I didn't get clearly how the California calling was like that. I think I have an idea, but please explain that a little bit more. How this was a kind of an endosymbiosis for you in a synchronicity form.
Okay, that's great question there, Bernard. I
You're welcome.
great question. No, it's quite straightforward. I, at one level, became incorporated or part of, or even at the center of, because I was the key organizer in the Mind Body Spirit Festival, the first one in San Francisco. So I became part of a greater whole, which was this spiritual community of people working on themselves at an inner level and working, I say with a little humor there, saving the planet. So I became I was then the little prokaryote or the unicellular organism coming in to be incorporated into this community where I was actually right at the hub, at the center of it. The Mind Body Spirit Festival in San Francisco had over 15,000 people there and amazing speakers and so on. But but the other thought there as well, it's like I saw it as going through a portal. So it was this expanding experience. So I've just been pondering on how does the little unicellular organism feel when it suddenly finds itself inside a cell where it's got more buddies and friends and they're all working together to keep the cell going. And so I just sort of feel that's a microcosmic view. I mean, the unicellular organism probably felt, wow, when it got incorporated. So that's kind of how I would, in a playful, imaginative way, see a connection.
Yeah, the play is so important here. I mean, we contributed to the playful universe. We may as well have some play happening around right here on Earth because that's where the play happens. We can do the universe is playing, but we want to be part of it. And you just had a playfulness where you go, the little cell gets into Marin County, north of San Francisco, at a time when there's a lot of cells running around and creating, having a bigger structure that you become then part of, while still also being part of yourself. But that is a descriptive version of almost like action, where you participated, but there was more to it than that. That it was transformative, like this endokaryote became part of your mind. That it influenced you, the outside and the inside, influenced how you thought about yourself and how you thought about the world afterwards. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was in California in Marin County, there was a wonderful bookshop. I love books. And I just had to have certain books. So all these must-have books ended up in a big trunk, which I had to have shipped over separately when I came back to England. And they still form part of my library now. So really the core theme of the evolution of consciousness has stayed with me, and what one might mean by the evolution of consciousness has stayed with me. And then watching the evolution of those transpersonal pioneers has been very interesting, whether it was Ken Wilber and seeing the work of Richard Tarnas blossoming in the world, and just tracking that work over the decades has been very meaningful. And to see, the excellent work coming out of the California Institute of Integral Studies and Pacifica Graduate School and what's happening in America is wonderful. And it's not that there aren't some similar initiatives in the UK and Europe, but it really was leading edge, a lot of what was happening there.
It still doesn't tell me how it affected
Um,
you. And we're talking about you. I mean, you mentioned the places in California and Santa Barbara that have something to do with continuing some work in the Jungian direction as well as other directions in consciousness. But what about you? This was transformative for you for to walk into an office in London wanting to go to California. I mean, Monica, this it's funny for me because I was in medical school and wanted to go to California myself and was able to like I wanted to go to San Francisco, but it ended up LA, which turned out to be better for me to be in Los Angeles and being opened to the psychedelic future that was going to happen in San Francisco, where I was going for a couple of years later. This was 1965. I was going there in
Ah,
1968. So that was a portal for me, just hitting Haight Street and Haight-Ashbury and knowing what was going to go on there. So that portal has transformed me into writing more and more about synchronicity. There was a lot of synchronicity happening on the streets of San Francisco. So that coincidence of going to LA and going to the portal and expanding my consciousness had a major impact. That's life-changing synchronicity that was. And walking into that office in London was a life-changing synchronicity for you to be catapulted, not any place, but in Marin County with all those great minds and all the foment and ferment going on there. So that's what I'm asking about, how that that little cell coming to that bigger cell has impacted your life.
it's impacted me enormously. And I would just say it wasn't as if I was a very conventional person before I went to California. I was very blessed to have a 4-year interdisciplinary degree, which included humanistic psychology and encounter groups and all sorts of explorations there. So I was fairly open, but it certainly did open me further and further and further. And I would say when I came back to England, I was actually quite homesick for California, having only been there for 7 months in total. But I just see it on a bigger level that it's like a spiritual family. And I feel I've kept up with the authors, kept connections, and still feel part of this bigger spiritual family, if you like, who are committed to giving their best to make this a more beautiful and better world. And so it's just the container, consciousness container that's stayed with me, if that makes sense.
It doesn't quite make sense because consciousness is defined in a lot of different ways. So please elaborate on what you mean by a consciousness container.
Well, perhaps the experience in California was of, again, lots of symbiotic interactions, mutual benefit, everybody helping each other because there was a higher purpose. And so there was that symbiotic element embedded in the holistic community. And Peter Russell, who I worked with at that point, he defined a high synergy society as a society with a high frequency of synchronicities. But coming back to what you were saying, I mean, I just used the term spiritual community earlier, but it would really just be people open to the transpersonal dimension, having something higher and not just being absorbed with their egos and the material realm only. And so I would see it very simplistically in those terms. I tend to see consciousness as the ground of all being, out of which everything emerges. But having said that, there's different levels of consciousness, and just to keep it very simple in a Jungian framework, that quite simply means evolving from just the ego level to a soul-based level and having ego and soul working well together.
As I listen to you and put it in the terms that I am using these days, is that you became part of a group mind. You were part of a group that met regularly in person, as you had to do back then. And there were a lot of synchronicities that happened in the group. There was no purpose to the group stated, but the purpose was being interacting with each other. And synchronicities came out of that, and that made your awareness, your sense of self, more part of them and more part of the general Marin County experience. So when I think of the way you describe it, your mind is still evolving with the minds of the people that you were involved with.
Absolutely. And when I first came back to England, I felt very alone because there were not many people speaking that language. But it's been very joyful for me to see all sorts of people, from Barbara Marx Hubbard to obviously Richard Tarnas and Ramdas and all the characters over there and becoming integrated into European awareness. And so I sort of feel it's all becoming more of one, and it's not about me physically having to be back in Marin County, but to keep the consciousness that I experienced as held there. And as you said, I became part of that group mind.
And you're still part of the group mind. You and I were part of a Synchronicity working group as part of the scientific and medical network. And you and I were able to have a good time at meeting earlier this year in July of 2024. When we were talking somewhat about synchronicity ideas, but during which some of them happened. And so it was very good for me and good for you to have our connection because we were thinking somewhat similarly about the synchronicity thing. There's a little bit more to that. There's a growing set of interest in this world now in synchronicity and meaningful coincidences, partly because we're having a lot of turmoil, and in chaos, synchronicities are more likely to happen because we're looking around for them, but they're also more likely to come into our consciousness. So I'm seeing you now with your endosymbiosis idea as a parallel to this what's going on with meaningful coincidences in the consciousness of this planet, and that you are part of that, and that I am part of that. So, would you comment on that, please?
Um, well, I obviously health of the intestinal flora is about biodiversity. And what I see that you're creating in a very lovely way with the Coincidence Project,
Thank you.
I see that it's like you have well, I'll just say a personal note. I spent over 30 years tending wildflower meadows with my husband, and um, supporting wildflowers and butterflies, a phenomenal diversity of butterflies and wildlife. And it was a real privilege to live in that diversity and in an intact ecosystem, which is very rare, 100% organic and so on. So back to the parallel. So I see in a way that you're supporting biodiversity of psychospiritual experiences by creating a field for wildflowers, but especially the wild orchids, which are the people who have had synchronicity experiences and are appearing in your podcasts. I mean, it's quite wonderful. You have this wonderful field of a meadow of these rare, gorgeous wildflowers. Does that make
Yeah.
any sense?
Oh, of course. I mean, you remember that I'd written about coincidences, synchronicity being wildflowers. They just pop up someplace.
Yeah.
And I forgot about that. So I appreciate your bringing that up. Where do we have about 15 minutes left in our conversation, and where do you where is the place of intuition as an evolutionary impulse?
Just to link between the wildflowers and intuition, I would just add that the god Pan, has been connected to spontaneity. And that's what's so magical about wildflowers. You can help to create the right conditions, but they're just spontaneous. So they have this magical quality or an enchantment. And to link that to intuition, I also feel, well, intuition, there's a spontaneous nature with intuition. Intuition's a very big subject, and I see intuition and as an evolutionary impulse closely linked to the sense of soul purpose and always moving towards greater levels of wholeness, which is the nature of the evolutionary process, is always moving to the next level of whole. And it's an interesting subject to write about because to try and pin down intuition actually isn't that easy, but I tend to see that one can look through various lenses, but one helpful one is the different qualities of intuition, whether sensed in an embodied way, in a physical kinesthetic way, through the feelings and an emotional intuition, and then emotional intelligence, and then intellectual intuition, which is really, I love intellectual intuition, really tuning into to leading edge ideas, and that's when really the library angel that Kursula talked about really operates very well. And then spiritual intuition, where I take my inspiration really from the work of Wolfgang von Goethe, who talked about intuitive perception. And he described this coming together of subject and object, so to experience more of a non-dual reality, a oneness, and that can be experienced in many ways. I think Roderick Mayne's book is excellent on that one, the Revelations of Chance, and the qualities of transformation that happen when you've had those different forms of intuition. And then intuition works, I call intuition has friends. It has a friends of imagination, it has friends with synchronicity, it's also friends with symbols and metaphors, and it's friends with stories and myths. So it's very difficult to see it completely separate from its ecosystem of other qualities. And I kind of think that of all of them, intuition and imagination are probably the very best of friends because they work so closely together. But synchronicity is obviously really in there as well, and we need intuition and imagination as well in the way we interpret and make meaning out of our synchronicities.
I really like I really like Friends of intuition. You're beginning you're talking again about endokaryotes, like this, like the coming together of different individual things into something broader. And it is a tendency of your thinking, which I didn't know before, is like that the individual continues to become part of something bigger while maintaining its own individuality. It's a basic process in the way you think about reality. I like to look for filters of people's minds about how they think, and I didn't know this one about you. And to be able to say this, the intuition has got a bunch of buddies, a bunch of friends, and Well, my best friend says intuition is like imagination. I said, okay, well, yeah, that's good. But there's also synchronicity is a good friend. In order to find meaning, it really helps to have some imagination, and rely on some of the messages that intuition can give you from your mind, from your heart, and from your gut, so that intuition, imagination, synchronicity, they become part of one ecosystem that is the way you think about things. It's just how you think. And it's a lovely way of thinking because it's something like the way I'm trying to think. I haven't gotten quite to the end, the bacteria and in the gut and the bacteria to the soul, and I'm getting there. Soil, I mean, soil. I didn't think of that, but that kind of like coming together, and as a one, as well as being separate. These are very good imaginative videos that you're describing because I like to see things. I like to see, a lot of people like to see things animated. And what you just did with the ecosystem of intuition is create a cartoon about how hey, Abe says intuition, talking from mind and heart and from gut. Hey, I'm buddies with imagination. I've got to imagine what this information is going to maybe mean. And then here's a synchronicity, and I've got to like use my imagination and my gut and heart and head feelings to see what the synchronicity might be. And that means I'll call in imagination to look to what it's telling me about usually the future. That's that's good.
Great. Well, I'm thrilled that you can see that, Bernard, because I was very lucky to do one of the first ecological university courses, and so you've got it in one. My thinking is always ecological, and there is always relations and dynamics and ideally symbiosis going on. So that is natural to my thinking. And something I haven't mentioned yet, which I would feel I'd have to mention really, is the importance of archetypes. And this is now going beyond Jung's archetypes. I have great respect for Jung and his archetypal discoveries and contemplation. But I think with synchronicities, it's really important to go into the depth through the archetype. That's when the level of transformation can be extraordinary. And I experienced this firsthand when I was writing, first working with Jung's pioneering case with a patient where the scarab comes to the window and he hands it to his patient just as she was recalling her dream about this jewelry. And but without going into too much detail, because most people know this now, but it really matters to really stay with the images, again, the images that emerge. And I think contemplation and reflection over time can really, really deepen the transformative capacity of a synchronicity, because one's actually accessing the archetype, and the archetype of synchronicity itself, linked to the scarab beetle, carries this profound archetype of rebirth, the Egyptian sun god and the rising of the morning sun, and this archetype of rebirth. So I actually feel that the field of synchronicity as a subject is not only seems to accelerate experiences of synchronicity, it acts in an evolutionary way, which could be expressed as a rebirth into, again, a portal into something new and bigger. I've rolled a few ideas together there, but I don't know if that makes sense to you. The rebirth energy that's carried in the field of synchronicity. itself.
So the best known synchronicity is a way of telling us that synchronicities are potentially ways to rebirth.
It certainly was for Jung himself, because they're digging deeper. Jung went through a very deep transformative experience and rebirth experience himself, because he was breaking away from Freud at that time and had a very difficult time. So reading around the time of Jung's life there also reveals a level of it not just being about his patient, but also for him personally. And I personally have experienced phenomenal evolution and feeling of rebirth around my work with synchronicity. Just seems to carry a very special level of information at the archetypal level, if that would be the best way to put it.
Well, whatever term you might use, archetypal being one of them, the process is go back to some of your meaningful coincidence, some of your synchronicities, and they have potentially in them rebirth. And you may find an archetype which is so variously defined, it becomes somewhat problematic, but also helpful. You have to wend your way through the archetypes to make sense of them for you personally. But one of what I think you're telling us, and we're coming near the end, is that while we didn't talk about meaning, uh, we're talking about meaning right now. That it's worth going back over some of your more profound synchronicities at a later stage, because they can help you make more transformation. And I can vouch for that from just talking with you, because there's a synchronicity in the California portal that you and I just went through earlier, that I didn't realize that you'd done something very similar to what I did. You went through the portal at a culturally powerful time in California culture uh, to change your consciousness. You were drawn to it, and it's still part of you. It's still you're growing with it. And I walk through a portal. I want to go to LA. You want to go to California somehow. And it happened that I and you ended up in places that have influenced us for the rest of our lives. So here, both of us are revisiting the California dreaming thing and
Mhm.
its influence on us. So we get in the future, we can like think about this coincidence of your life and my life having this parallel that I didn't know about before, as clearly as I do now. So uh, we can end with a synchronicity that between us that we can be able to ponder sometime in the future and see each of us and together what it might mean.
Well, thank you, Bernard. I'd like to just have a final say that I appreciate how your work is raising awareness about synchronicity or meaningful coincidences and serendipity, and increasing the morphic resonance of the field. And especially exciting to me is that so much good work is going on now in academic research and scholarly works. And in my intuition chapter, I coined the term world wisdom web. So I feel that you're making a wonderful contribution to the world wisdom web.
With that, Monica, I say thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.